It's a really great pleasure to be here today in Chile and have the opportunity to talk to you about the ecology of invasions. It's a really fantastic opportunity for me, and I'm really very grateful to all of our funders and the University of Chile and Audrey and Tanya for organising for Peter Brown and I to be here with you all. So I'm going to talk about unravelling the ecology of invasions from individuals to communities. I think we're all aware, wherever we are in the world, that the number of non-native species arriving in new regions is growing and growing. And here we can see over time, this is the picture for Europe, for instance, but pretty much you could draw this graph anywhere in the world and you'd see this rapid escalation in the number of new arrivals. So when I'm talking about non-native species, I mean those species that have been introduced in one way or another by humans. And then I'll also use the term invasive non-native species, and then I'm referring to the small proportion that cause some kind of problem. And sometimes I'll interchange between non-native and alien, and I apologise for that, but I mean exactly the same thing. But I know we have different terms in different places around the world. So it has been proposed that climate change and invasion, in terms of being drivers of biodiversity change, could be described as but actually there's been very little work on that, and I really think there's opportunities to do more in that regard. But I also think that there are many, many other interacting factors that we need to take into account. So here is some work that we have been doing looking at the trade networks and how they influence the movement of non-native species all around the world. And we can see it's quite a spectacular picture of the movement of species into one country and out to another. So there's no doubt about it that this sort of globalization and environmental change are likely to be facilitating invasion. And different factors will vary in their importance through the invasion process. And here's some really lovely work by Regan Early and her team looking at global threats from invasive alien species. And she's basically shown that there are a whole variety of traits that influence introduction, particularly around the trade movement and imports. And then there's a variety of other factors that influence establishment, and that might be to do with habitat and increased agricultural intensification, for instance, or in this case fire as well. So when we're looking at these non-native species, they're really fascinating from an ecological perspective, and they're fascinating for a whole variety of reasons, but also, of course, they're extremely worrying and extremely costly, both in terms of the economy and society, and perhaps for my interest more in terms of their cost to biodiversity. So I think this is a really excellent example. This is Hottentot fig, and we can see in the left side it's there in its native range in South Africa, and I was lucky enough to travel there and saw the Hottentot fig, and there it was surrounded by penguins on these sand dune systems. And then back closer to my home in the west of England, we see Hottentot fig growing along the dune systems in a huge monoculture. And we can see the footprint of something like Hottentot fig above ground, but actually I think it is really important to remember that not all non-native species cause problems or are considered to be bad. In fact, some of them are celebrated, and this is a ladybird called the bryony ladybird that was first seen in the UK in the mid-1990s, and you can see from the map it's really got a very, very limited distribution even 20 years on from its arrival, and actually people really quite enjoy seeing it, and it only feeds on white bryony and doesn't pose a threat in any way at all. But in contrast, the Harlequin ladybird has really become a global invader. I just present the data here for the UK, but you have fantastic data in Chile as well, showing the distribution and spread of this species, and it's spread really very rapidly, and in the UK spreading at about 100 kilometres per year. And the reason it's concerning is because it is a voracious predator, and it is also quite a generalist predator. It will eat a whole range of different insects, for instance, not just pest insects for which it was introduced into some countries, but also other species as well. And then some of the species, we really find it very difficult to know whether they're good or they're bad, and I think that's where we begin to see some of the contention arising in the field of invasion ecology. And one of those species, for example, is Buddleja, which grows very profusely in the UK in many urban environments. It's a fantastic nectar source for pollinating insects, but it does cause a problem for the railway system, for instance. It causes infrastructure problems. So we have differing perspectives around these non-native species, and it is an interesting field. It does really seem to divide people at times, and actually that can be very unhelpful, because it is very clear that some of the non-native species, the invasive component, do pose a threat, and that there should be some prioritisation around them in terms of some action so that we can protect the biodiversity. And it's not all about just protecting the native biodiversity or gardening in some way or another, or keeping things the way they've always been. It's about protecting the function of those ecosystems. But those differing perspectives are really highlighted in this book here called The New Wild, where essentially the journalist Fred Pearce states that invasive species will be nature's salvation, because essentially he's stating that we've caused so much damage to our ecosystems that the only things that are really thriving are these invasive species, and they will carry out the functions and some of the nuances within the field. So I believe it's really important to counter controversy through science communication, and I have a passion for science communication, and I've had lots of amazing opportunities to talk and give interviews for newspapers, etc. And I really love those opportunities. And this is a programme that I went on for the BBC so that Fred Pearce and I could discuss invasive species and weigh up the evidence between us with respect to the threat they pose, and just try and unravel some of these controversies. And as I've already mentioned, I think my big concern is that if we ignore the complexity, if we make it too simplistic in terms of our interpretation and understanding of the function of species, then there is a real danger that we won't protect the systems that we should be protecting. And for sure, the media have been absolutely fantastic in terms of promoting the kind of science that I do and the science that other people do, but sometimes the complexities and the nuances of these ecological systems that we know are extremely complex get missed along the way. And this is one of the examples where we have here the Harlequin ladybird Harmonia axipidis and 7-spot ladybird Coccinella punctata. Actually, they're both invaders in different places in different parts of the world, and actually they're both cannibalistic, but this headline would suggest that Harmonia axipidis is far worse than Coccinella punctata, and it is hard to get those nuanced messages. And it's important because we need robust evidence for decision making. We need to inform policymakers, for instance, with respect to what is happening with our environment, and we need to be assessing whether or not various sort of mitigation strategies are working to address some of the threats that are posed. And with invasive non-native species, the cost to Europe, for example, is quoted to be about 12 billion euros per year. And so there's a clear need for some effective decision making to bring that cost down, but not just the economic cost, but also then the cost to biodiversity and indeed society. And in the UK we produce these biodiversity indicators on an annual basis, and it's a great way to demonstrate the sort of state of nature, if you like, to our policymakers. So one of the projects that I lead within the UK is called the GB Non-Native Species Information Portal, and essentially we collate information on all non-native species in Britain and a whole variety of attributes alongside that, including their pathways of arrival, when they first arrived, where they first arrived, what kind of functional group they are. And we know from that database, which is being constantly updated, that we have 2,000 established non-native species in Britain. So by established, I mean they are the ones that are reproductively active or having sustained populations within Britain. And every year we produce a scorecard to try and summarise this information. So this is the scorecard for last year, where we could see that it was just under 2,000 established species in total, with plants being the numerically dominant species. But then if we look at the impacts further down the slide, we can see that the very, very low proportion, only about 6.6% of all the plants, pose any kind of threat, whereas about a third of the non-native animals do pose a threat. I'm particularly interested in insects and insect community ecology, and we can look at invertebrate invasions over time, and again we see a very similar figure to the one that we saw for the figure for new arrivals within Europe. And it's quite interesting, I think, to see, for example, in Britain, one of our first reported invaders was this cockroach, but some of our later invaders include things such as the Asian hornet, Vespa velutina. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is it's all very well that we document these invasions and produce this comprehensive database of non-native species, but can we actually predict invasions? Because actually that would help us or help policymakers in terms of the necessary surveillance to be able to putting in measures for prevention. So we undertook what's called a consensus workshop, where we gathered experts together across a variety of different groups: plants, freshwater invertebrates and fish, marine species, vertebrates, terrestrial invertebrates. And we let them gather as much information as they possibly could from their own knowledge, but also from the literature, and combine all of that information together so that we could begin to rank species and think about which ones are the ones that are likely to arrive, establish and spread within the next decade and threaten biodiversity in one way or another. So that we've published this work in Global Change Biology in 2014, and you can see it's a long list of co-authors, and some of these are from our volunteer sector, the volunteer experts who run some of our so-called recording schemes in Britain to gather information on particular species groups. So a whole variety of different people from various different backgrounds. We now know that just in the last few years, 7 out of the 10 species that we ranked as being the top threat have now arrived. And sometimes I wonder, is that cause for celebration, or is that cause for thinking, well, we should have done something about it? But nevertheless, I think what it shows is that there are ways in which we can predict invasions, and now what we need to do is think about how we then use that information to prevent their arrival in one way or another. So one of our top 10 species that arrived just last September was Vespa velutina, the Asian hornet. It's a species that originally arrived from Asia into France, just a completely random chance event, arrived in a pottery consignment in Bordeaux in France, and it has spread quite rapidly through France, and so therefore not surprising that we were anticipating its arrival within Britain, and the first records arrived last September. We're rather hoping that they have been eradicated, the nests have been found, but we will be putting some surveillance into place over the next month or two, so from February onwards, to see and to check those sites again and to keep our early warning systems running in full force. So one of the things that we did actually as well when we first knew it had arrived is we created an app so that we can make it easier for people to be able to report sightings of the Asian hornet or things that they might think of the Asian hornet. And this will be particularly important for beekeepers to use, for instance, because this is a species that is particularly fond of eating honeybees. One of our other species that we found within our top 20 was the Argentine ant. We would have put this slightly higher actually, but we feel we need a little more climate warming in order for it to be able to survive our winters here. But having said that, actually I read a paper just this week that suggests there is a colony in London that has managed to sustain for a few years. They think probably by moving into buildings for the winter but then spreading outwards afterwards. And these ants are a problem because they're what we call ecosystem engineers, and they can really have very profound influences on the ecosystems in which they arrive. Really fascinating insects, but really quite a concern once they're spotted. We had marine species on our list as well, including this Asian shore crab, which was one of the first species from our list that was reported in Wales. we had one species we put at #1 position, and that was the quagga mussel, Dreissena rostiformis. And this is again an ecosystem engineer. It has really amazing effects of cascading effects within water bodies. It's a fantastic filter feeder, so it really alters the algal community, which then has knock-on effects to other species within these freshwater systems. But it also deposits toxic feces, for instance, and so has some changes of a negative kind within those water bodies as well. One of the species that was on our list was the racoon, and I think some people thought, why are we putting racoon on the list? That seems a little bit crazy. But there are raccoons in captivity in quite large numbers across the UK, and we knew that in Austria and Germany, for instance, they've had a problem with raccoon populations building up. They're great escape artists. And it wasn't long after our list was published that somebody sent this photo through on Twitter, actually, to say, this is a raccoon, isn't it? And there it was within their garden. We also have some freshwater plants on our list, and this Myriophyllum was one that was spotted last year. Very hard to identify and to distinguish from some of our native species, so it took a little while to be sure of its identity, but it was confirmed last year. So one of the things that we have also devised is a system for alien alerts, where we can encourage people to report their biological records, feed them into a database, get an expert to check out that record, and then feed the information to all the stakeholders that need to know about it, and then have some action on the ground. And that action isn't necessarily all about eradication. It might be about containment and biosecurity, for instance, and a campaign called Stop the Spread, where kayakers and fishermen are asked to check and clean and dry their equipment, so that they're not spreading some of these species, such as the quagga mussel, to other water bodies. Some of the work that I've also been leading has been to inform a new European regulation. So this European regulation came into force in 2015, and it's really based around prevention of the arrival of species. And it's been really welcomed by many people. And at the very core of this regulation is a list of species that are thought to pose a threat and that should have some action around them, whether it be to do with trade or whether it be to do with action on the ground if they're spotted, but certainly to do with communication between European countries notifying each other what is arriving within their domain. And one of the pieces of work we've been doing for that is around prioritising pathways, thinking about which of the pathways which are bringing in the most troublesome species, and can we get better at collating this pathway information and understanding how species are getting from one place to another. And one of the things we had to do was to create and harmonise pathway terminology, because many people in different databases were using all kinds of different terminology. So we produced a terminology based originally on one that Phil Hume from New Zealand had produced, but we refined it slightly and produced some definitions and published it within the Convention on Biological Diversity Technical Advisory Notes. This has allowed us to bring together data from a variety of databases and to begin to map pathways. So we've used our CBD pathways to map the Global Invasive Species database and also the Delivering Alien Invasive Species Inventory for Europe database, so that we can gather all the information together in one place. And we've just published this paper in the Journal of Applied Ecology, where we're able to look at the different pathways of arrival, whether they be intentional or unintentional at a very crude level, but we can also break that down into the actual individual pathways that we see within that CBD definition, and see how that varies between different taxonomic groups and between different environments, for instance. And then very recently as well, we've published another pathway looking at tackling pathways of biological invasion, and again looking in more detail at what is moving marine species, freshwater species and terrestrial arthropods around. And we can see there's very different patterns between the different systems and between the different taxonomic groups. So with the terrestrial arthropods, for instance, we can see that a large number, we don't know how they're getting here, but even larger number we know they're arriving in contaminated commodities. I'm really fascinated by parasites and diseases, and I think that we often ignore them. Perhaps sometimes we ignore them because they're quite fiddly and quite complicated, and it's hard for us to get an understanding of them. But I really think that we need to begin to think more about wildlife diseases in the context of invasions. Many of these wonderful databases that we now have around the world documenting non-native species simply don't include anything on microbes, or if they do, it's a very, very limited and certainly not comprehensive information. And so I had a workshop through a project that I lead called Cost Action, a cooperation in science and technology, where we again gathered together a group of experts from a range of different taxonomic and environmental expertise to look at why was it we weren't understanding better invasions and wildlife disease, and how could we perhaps prevent something like the chytrid fungus that we all know about. And we published this as a short correspondence within Nature, but we have recently published it in Conservation Letters as a full publication. So this is the cost action that I mentioned, Alien Challenge, and I've been leading this for 4 years. It comes to an end this year, and it's been an absolute delight. We've had many, many meetings. We've had what's called short-term scientific missions, where people, particularly early-stage researchers, have travelled all around the world to go and work in other labs and gain other experiences. We've run training schools around marine identification or around distribution modelling. We've had workshops, for example, to try and understand socio-economic impacts of alien species. It really has been a very, very exciting project to lead, and fantastic collaboration with people not just in Europe but all around the world. So what are our future directions? Well, I'm here in Chile working with Audrey and Tanya, and also Pete Brown's come too, and we're all working together on Harmonia axiphilis in particular, but we're very interested in citizen science and its applicability to other systems, particularly how it can be used within invasion biology. And I'm really delighted to have such a wonderful collaboration with people here, and I'm very grateful for that. I've also been working increasingly with people in Eastern Europe because it's really interesting to try and understand some of these systems along spatial gradients, for example, and to understand why do we see differences and what are the similarities. I've already mentioned that I'm very interested in the idea of using citizen science to help us understand alien species ecology, and also to help with surveillance and monitoring, for example. And again, I was delighted to be involved in this collaboration where we were looking at what kind of variables should we be monitoring globally in order to understand biological invasions at that global scale. And it was really seen that countries capitalizing on citizen science, as well as emerging online and remote technologies and data capture, would really improve our understanding of invasion ecology. And we've published a few things from this. There's now a paper out, but also we published a sort of a more glossy PDF where we go into a little more detail in a more accessible way. And then just last summer, I had the absolute pleasure of going to East Africa and leading a workshop with the Tropical Biological Association, funded by the British Ecological Society in part, but also by my own organisation, and also with the TBA. And we looked at citizen science very broadly, but actually alien species were mentioned there as well. And we came up with some priorities and sort of the opportunities and barriers around citizen science, and very excited that we're doing something very similar here in Chile this week. And it's going to be really interesting to make comparisons between different places in terms of what can we learn from one another, so that we can more effectively deliver these sort of large scale citizen science projects to address these big ecological questions we want to be addressing. So thank you all very, very much for listening, and I'm really very grateful to all of my funders that you can see a whole variety displayed here: JNCC, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and also the NERC and my own centre, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, but also Alien Challenge, which is funded with European funding. My many collaborators, many volunteers have contributed to the work that I do, but also other collaborators from within GB as well. So thank you very much for listening.